way! Clear the path! He needs help!
Step aside, quickly!
Ride hard, men! We must reach them by dawn!
Faster!
The bullet tore through Abraham Lincoln's skull at 10:13 p.m. on April 14th, 1865. But what happened in the hours that followed would shock a nation in ways that history books rarely reveal. The 16th President of the United States slumped forward in his theater seat as Mary Todd Lincoln's screams pierced through Ford's Theater. Yet this moment of national tragedy was merely the beginning of a conspiracy so vast that its true dimensions would remain hidden for generations. John Wilkes Booth landed on the stage below with such force that his leg snapped like a dry twig, the crack audible even above the chaos erupting throughout the theater. Blood streamed from the president's wound as Major Henry Rathbone lunged at the assassin, but Booth's knife found flesh first, slashing deep into Rathbone's arm. The actor turned murderer limped toward the stage door, shouting words that would echo through American history. Yet what he said remains disputed to this very day. Some witnesses swore he yelled the Virginia state motto, while others heard something entirely different. Why would the accounts vary so dramatically? What else happened that night that witnesses couldn't agree upon? The president's body was carried across the street to the Peterson House, a narrow boarding establishment where a young man named William Clark rented a room. Lincoln was too tall for the bed, so they laid him diagonally across the mattress, his great frame finally at rest after years of bearing the weight of a nation torn apart by civil war. But in those dark hours as Lincoln lay dying, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton began an investigation that would uncover a plot far more sinister than anyone initially imagined. "Now he belongs to the ages," Stanton would famously declare when Lincoln drew his last breath at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th. But those words masked a terrible truth that Stanton was only beginning to comprehend. The assassination wasn't the work of a lone madman driven by Confederate sympathies. It was a coordinated attack on the entire United States government, planned with military precision and executed with ruthless determination. While Lincoln struggled for life in that cramped bedroom, other assassins were hunting their targets through the streets of Washington. Lewis Powell, a former Confederate soldier standing 6 feet tall with powerful shoulders and cold eyes, forced his way into Secretary of State William Seward's home at approximately the same moment Booth pulled the trigger at Ford's Theater. Seward was already bedridden, recovering from a serious carriage accident that had left his jaw broken and his face swollen with pain. Powell talked his way past the butler, claiming he carried medicine for the ailing secretary, but once inside he revealed his true purpose with terrifying violence. The assassin charged up the stairs and burst into Seward's bedroom, where he produced a large knife and began slashing at everyone in his path. Seward's son, Frederick, tried to stop him and received brutal blows to the head that fractured his skull in multiple places. Seward's other son, Augustus, grappled with Powell, as did a male nurse named George Robinson. The room became a scene of absolute carnage as Powell stabbed wildly, his blade finding Seward's face and neck multiple times. Only the metal brace that doctors had fitted to Seward's broken jaw saved his life, deflecting what should have been a killing blow. Blood covered the walls and floor as Powell fought his way back down the stairs, stabbing a State Department messenger named Emmerich Hansel, who had the misfortune of arriving at that exact moment. The assassin escaped into the night, leaving 5 people severely wounded, though miraculously none would die from their injuries. But why did Powell's attack fail when Booth's succeeded? Was it merely chance, or was there something more at play? The third prong of the conspiracy targeted Vice President Andrew Johnson at the Kirkwood House Hotel where he was staying. George Surratt, a German immigrant and carriage maker, had been assigned to kill Johnson and throw the government into complete chaos. Surratt checked into a room directly above the vice president and spent hours pacing, working up the courage to commit murder. He had a revolver and a knife, the same weapons his co-conspirators carried, but as the hours ticked by, something inside Surratt broke. He visited the hotel bar and drank heavily, his hands trembling as he lifted glass after glass to his lips. Other patrons noticed the strange man who seemed terrified of his own shadow, muttering to himself and starting at every sound. When the time came to act, Surratt's nerve failed completely. He left the knife on a dresser in his room, threw his revolver away, and wandered the streets of Washington in a drunken stupor. Andrew Johnson lived because a would-be assassin discovered he didn't have the stomach for murder. The conspiracy had been months in the making, born from the desperate fantasies of John Wilkes Booth and nurtured in secret meetings at Mary Surratt's boarding house on H Street. Booth was no ordinary actor stumbling through life in obscurity. He came from America's most famous theatrical family, the son of the renowned Junius Brutus Booth and brother to Edwin Booth, who many considered the finest actor in the nation. John Wilkes Booth earned a substantial income from his performances, commanded attention wherever he went, and had no shortage of admirers among Washington's elite. But beneath the handsome facade and theatrical charm, Booth harbored an obsession with the Confederate cause that bordered on madness. He saw Lincoln not as a president trying to preserve the Union, but as a tyrant destroying the South's way of life. Booth never served in the Confederate military, a fact that seemed to gnaw at his conscience. Perhaps that's why he felt compelled to strike the blow he believed would make him a hero to millions. The original conspiracy had been even more ambitious. Booth initially planned to kidnap Lincoln, not kill him, and hold the president hostage in exchange for Confederate prisoners of war. He recruited a network of Confederate sympathizers and agents, including John Surratt, the son of Mary Surratt, who worked as a courier for the Confederate Secret Service. The group made at least one attempt to capture Lincoln in March 1865, planning to seize him during a carriage ride to a military hospital. But Lincoln changed his plans at the last moment, and the kidnapping plot collapsed. When Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, Booth's dreams of Confederate victory died with the Army of Northern Virginia. In the days that followed, his plan transformed from kidnapping to assassination. If he couldn't save the Confederacy, he would at least avenge its defeat. On April 14th, Booth learned that Lincoln would attend Ford's Theater that evening to watch a performance of Our American Cousin, a popular comedy. The theater was like a second home to Booth, who had performed there many times and knew every entrance, exit, and hiding place. What happened next reveals details that most people never learn about that fateful night. Booth arrived at the theater around 9:30 p.m. and calmly made his way to the saloon next door, where he ordered a whiskey and engaged in casual conversation with the bartender. Witnesses reported that he seemed perfectly relaxed, showing no signs of the terrible deed he was about to commit. He checked his weapons one final time, including the single-shot Derringer pistol that would fire the fatal bullet, and the large knife he carried as backup. Lincoln sat in the presidential box with Mary Todd Lincoln, Major Henry Rathbone, and Rathbone's fiancée, Clara Harris. The box was decorated with American flags and a portrait of George Washington, symbols of the Union that Lincoln had fought so hard to preserve. John Parker, the police officer assigned to guard the president, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He left his post outside the box and wandered off, possibly to get a better view of the play or to visit the same saloon where Booth had just been drinking. Booth entered the theater and made his way up the stairs to the presidential box with no one to stop him. He had bored a small hole in the door to the box earlier that day, allowing him to observe the interior before entering. He also prepared a wooden bar that could be wedged against the door to prevent anyone from interrupting him. These preparations showed a level of calculation that contradicted the image of an impulsive madman acting on sudden passion. The play reached its funniest scene, and the audience erupted in laughter. Booth knew the script by heart and had timed his approach perfectly. He raised the Derringer, aimed at the back of Lincoln's head from a distance of less than 5 feet, and squeezed the trigger. The president never saw his killer, never had a moment to defend himself or cry out. The bullet entered behind Lincoln's left ear, tore through his brain, and lodged behind his right eye. He would never regain consciousness. Mary Todd Lincoln's screams brought the laughter to an abrupt halt as the audience struggled to comprehend what had just happened. Major Rathbone realized the danger and rushed at Booth, but the actor was quicker. He slashed at Rathbone with his knife, cutting deep into the Major's arm from elbow to shoulder. Rathbone would later say that Booth's eyes contained a wild, almost inhuman gleam as he attacked. Blood from Rathbone's wound splattered across Mary Todd Lincoln's dress as she cradled her dying husband. Booth vaulted over the railing of the presidential box, aiming for the stage 12 feet below, but his spur caught on one of the decorative flags, throwing off his landing. He crashed onto the stage, and the fibula bone in his left leg snapped on impact. The pain must have been excruciating, yet Booth managed to rise and face the audience. What he said in that moment has been debated ever since. Many witnesses reported hearing Sic semper tyrannis, the Virginia state motto meaning "thus always to tyrants." Others claimed he shouted, "The South is avenged," or "Revenge for the South." Some heard both phrases while a few heard neither. The actor in Booth couldn't resist this final dramatic gesture, playing to his last audience even as he committed the crime that would make him the most hated man in America. He limped across the stage, shoving aside actress Laura Keene, who had rushed forward in shock. Orchestra leader William Withers, Jr. tried to grab him but couldn't get a solid hold. Booth escaped through the stage door where he had left a horse waiting, climbed into the saddle despite his broken leg, and disappeared into the Washington night. Back in the presidential box, chaos reigned as doctors in the audience rushed forward to help. Charles Leal, a young army surgeon just 23 years old, reached Lincoln first. He later described finding the president slumped in his chair with no apparent pulse or respiration. Leal's fingers probed through Lincoln's hair until they found the bullet hole, blood clotting around the wound. He cleared the blood clot to relieve pressure on the brain, and Lincoln began breathing again. but Leal knew immediately that the wound was mortal. The decision was made to move Lincoln from the theater to somewhere he could die in peace and dignity. Several men carried the president out into the street, where they debated which direction to go. A man named Henry Safford stood on the steps of the Peterson house across the street, waving his arms and calling for them to bring Lincoln there. They carried him up the narrow stairs to a small bedroom at the rear of the house, where they laid the president diagonally across a bed too short for his 6'4" frame. As the long night progressed, Lincoln's breathing became increasingly labored. Cabinet members arrived, family members gathered, and Secretary of War Stanton began coordinating the government's response. Mary Todd Lincoln wept uncontrollably, crying out, "Why didn't they kill me instead?" She visited the bedroom multiple times but couldn't bear to stay, overwhelmed by grief and trauma. Robert Lincoln, the president's eldest son, stood by his father's bedside through the night, watching helplessly as Lincoln's life slipped away. The rain that had fallen earlier in the day resumed as dawn approached, as if nature itself mourned the dying president. Lincoln's pulse grew weaker, his breathing more shallow and irregular. At 7:22 a.m., surrounded by family and government officials, Abraham Lincoln drew his final breath. Secretary Stanton reportedly said, "Now he belongs to the ages," though some witnesses claimed he said, "Now he belongs to the angels." Like so much else about that night, even the exact words remain uncertain. The manhunt for Booth and his co-conspirators became the largest in American history up to that point. Stanton coordinated a massive effort involving thousands of soldiers, police officers, and federal agents. Telegraph wires hummed with descriptions of the fugitives, and roadblocks appeared throughout Maryland and Virginia. Rewards totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars were offered for information, leading to the capture of the conspirators. The net began to close almost immediately on some of the plotters, while others managed to evade capture for days or weeks. Lewis Powell made a critical mistake by returning to Mary Surratt's boarding house on April 17th, arriving just as police were questioning Mary about her connection to Booth. Powell claimed to be a laborer hired to dig a ditch, but his fine clothing and soft hands betrayed the lie. Officers arrested him on the spot, and Mary's weak denial that she knew him sealed her own fate. George Surratt was captured on April 20th after bragging drunkenly in a Maryland tavern about his connection to the conspiracy. David Harold, who had guided Booth's escape and accompanied him throughout his flight, would be caught with Booth 12 days after the assassination. But where was John Wilkes Booth during those 12 days that the nation held its breath? The story of his flight reveals a desperate man coming to terms with the fact that he was not a hero, but a hunted criminal. Booth and Harold rode south from Washington, crossed the Navy Yard Bridge around 11 p.m. on the night of the assassination, and made their way to Surrattsville, Maryland, where they retrieved weapons and supplies that had been hidden earlier. Booth's broken leg caused him terrible pain with every movement, but fear and determination pushed him forward. They reached the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd around 4 a.m. on April 15th. Dr. Mudd set Booth's broken leg and provided a makeshift splint, then allowed the fugitives to rest at his home until evening. Mudd would later claim he didn't recognize Booth, though evidence suggested otherwise. His involvement in treating the assassin would cost him dearly, leading to imprisonment and a narrow escape from execution. Booth and Harold spent several days hiding in pine thickets and swamps in southern Maryland, waiting for an opportunity to cross the Potomac River into Virginia. They contacted Thomas Jones, a Confederate agent who brought them food and newspapers. It was while reading those newspapers that Booth discovered the terrible truth about his actions. He was not celebrated as a hero. The newspapers called him a murderer, a coward, and a villain. Even many Confederate sympathizers condemned the assassination as dishonorable and shameful. Booth's diary entries from this period reveal his growing desperation and self-justification. He wrote, "I have too great a soul to die like a criminal. Oh, may he spare me that, and let me die bravely." He compared himself to Brutus, who assassinated Julius Caesar, and insisted that he had struck a blow for freedom against tyranny. But these were the words of a man trying to convince himself that his actions had meaning and purpose. After finally crossing the Potomac, Booth and Harold made their way through Virginia, seeking refuge with Confederate sympathizers. They stayed briefly at the home of Richard Garrett, a farmer who believed Booth was a wounded Confederate soldier. The Garrett family had no idea they were harboring Lincoln's assassin, but Federal troops were closing in, following a trail of witnesses and informants who had seen the fugitives. On the morning of April 26th, 26 Union cavalrymen surrounded the Garrett tobacco barn where Booth and Harold had spent the night. Lieutenant Edward Doherty commanded the troops, with Lieutenant Luther Baker and Detective Everton Conger leading the effort. They called for the men inside to surrender. Harold quickly gave himself up, but Booth refused. What happened next remains one of the most controversial moments of the entire assassination story. Did Booth die by his own hand, or was he deliberately shot against orders? The official account states that Sergeant Boston Corbett, a deeply religious man who claimed God told him to act, fired through a crack in the barn wall after seeing Booth raise his weapon. The bullet struck Booth in the neck, severing his spinal cord in almost the exact same spot where Booth's bullet had entered Lincoln's head. Booth lived for several hours, paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. His last reported words were, "Tell my mother I died for my country," and "Useless, useless." But many questions surround Corbett's actions that morning. Some historians believe Corbett deliberately executed Booth to prevent him from being captured alive. Others suggest that powerful figures wanted Booth dead to prevent a trial that might reveal embarrassing connections or broader conspiracies. Corbett himself became increasingly unstable in later years, eventually pulling a gun during a session of the Kansas House of Representatives and being committed to an insane asylum. He escaped in 1888 and vanished, never to be seen again. The trial of the conspirators began on May 9, 1865, less than a month after Lincoln's death. 8 people faced charges before a military tribunal: Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, George Atzerodt, Dr. Samuel Mudd, Michael O'Laughlin, Samuel Arnold, and Edmund Spangler. The trial was controversial from the start, with many questioning whether civilians should be tried before a military court, rather than in civilian courts with full due process protections. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of conspiracy, detailing meetings at Mary Surratt's boarding house and the coordinated nature of the attacks on Lincoln, Seward, and the planned attack on Johnson. Witnesses testified about conversations and preparations, weapons and supplies, comings and goings in the days and weeks before the assassination. The defendants had limited ability to mount effective defenses, and the outcome was never really in doubt. Mary Surratt's trial became particularly controversial. The evidence against her was substantial but largely circumstantial. She provided a safe house for the conspirators to meet. She knew many of them personally, including Booth. And she made suspicious trips to Surrattsville on the day of the assassination. But did she actually know about the murder plot? Or was she simply an unlucky Confederate sympathizer caught up in events beyond her control? The military commission found all 8 defendants guilty. Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Herold, and George Atzerodt were sentenced to death by hanging. Dr. Samuel Mudd, Michael O'Laughlin, and Samuel Arnold received life sentences. Edmund Spangler, a stagehand accused of helping Booth escape from the theater, received 6 years. The executions were scheduled for July 7, 1865, giving the condemned just days to prepare for death. The execution of Mary Surratt sparked intense controversy and debate that continues to this day. She would be the first woman executed by the United States federal government, and many people believed her punishment was too severe. 5 of the 9 judges on the military commission signed a petition for clemency, recommending that President Andrew Johnson commute her sentence to life imprisonment due to her age and sex. Johnson claimed he never saw the petition, though this seems unlikely given its importance. On the morning of July 7th, crowds gathered at the Washington Arsenal where the execution was to take place. The condemned prisoners were led up the steps of the scaffold, their ankles and wrists bound, white hoods placed over their heads. Mary Surratt was so weak from fear and grief that she had to be supported by soldiers. The nooses were placed around their necks and adjusted. A single blow to a support beam would drop the platform and hang all 4 conspirators simultaneously. But before the trap could be sprung, a carriage raced toward the arsenal. Could it be a last-minute reprieve for Mary Surratt? The crowd held its breath as the carriage approached, but it carried only spectators delayed by traffic. At 1:15 p.m., the executioner knocked away the supports and the platform fell. Lewis Powell died quickly, his powerful neck broken cleanly by the fall. But the others struggled and choked, taking several minutes to die. Mary Surratt's body swayed gently in the summer breeze as spectators watched in grim silence. The execution of the conspirators did not end the controversies surrounding Lincoln's assassination. Questions and theories proliferated almost immediately and have never stopped. Was the conspiracy limited to Booth and his immediate circle, or did it extend further into Confederate leadership? Did Confederate President Jefferson Davis know about or authorize the plot? Were there Northern sympathizers or government officials involved? Why were some obvious leads in the investigation never pursued? One of the most persistent theories involves Confederate Secret Service operations in Canada. The Confederate government maintained a network of agents operating from Canadian bases, and these agents engaged in various plots against the Union, including attempts to burn down New York City and free Confederate prisoners. John Surratt fled to Canada after the assassination, aided by Confederate agents, and eventually escaped to Europe. Some evidence suggests that Confederate officials in Canada knew about Booth's plans, though whether they approved or encouraged them remains unclear. Another controversial aspect involves the testimony of Louis Weichmann, a friend of John Surratt who boarded at Mary Surratt's house. Weichmann provided crucial testimony against Mary Surratt and the other conspirators, but he may have been threatened or coerced by prosecutors. He later expressed guilt about his role in Mary Surratt's execution, suggesting his testimony may not have been entirely truthful or that he regretted its consequences. The treatment of Dr. Samuel Mudd also generated lasting controversy. Mudd consistently claimed he didn't recognize Booth when he treated his broken leg, despite evidence that they had met at least twice before. He was sent to Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas, a remote military prison off the coast of Florida. In 1867, a yellow fever epidemic swept through the fort, killing the prison doctor. Mudd volunteered to treat the sick, saving many lives and earning gratitude from soldiers and prisoners alike. President Andrew Johnson pardoned Mudd in 1869, though his name remained tainted by association with Lincoln's assassination. The phrase, "his name is Mudd," meaning someone's reputation is ruined, likely predates Dr. Mudd's involvement in the assassination. But the association between the unfortunate doctor and the expression has become fixed in popular imagination. Mudd's descendants have spent more than a century trying to clear his name and prove his innocence, with limited success. The fate of John Surratt, Mary's son, provides another fascinating chapter in the assassination story. Unlike the other conspirators, John Surratt escaped to Europe with help from Confederate agents and Catholic priests. He served briefly in the Papal Zouaves, the Pope's military force, before being recognized and arrested in Egypt in 1866. He was returned to the United States to stand trial, but by then the political climate had changed dramatically. His trial ended in a hung jury, and prosecutors declined to retry him. John Surratt lived until 1916, giving lectures about the assassination and maintaining his innocence, despite overwhelming evidence of his involvement in the conspiracy. The impact of Lincoln's assassination on American history cannot be overstated. Had Lincoln lived, Reconstruction might have proceeded very differently. Lincoln favored a more lenient approach to bringing Southern states back into the Union, famously declaring, "with malice toward none, with charity for all," in his second inaugural address. Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, was a Democrat and former slaveholder who sympathized with white Southerners and opposed civil rights for freed slaves. Johnson's weak enforcement of civil rights laws and his battles with Congress led to his impeachment and helped lay the groundwork for the oppressive Jim Crow system that would dominate the South for a century. Mary Todd Lincoln never recovered from witnessing her husband's murder. She became increasingly unstable and paranoid, convinced that people were trying to poison or rob her. In 1875, her son Robert had her committed to a mental institution, though she was released after a few months. She spent her final years traveling in Europe and living in obscurity, dying in 1882 at the age of 63. Major Henry Rathbone, who was wounded trying to stop Booth, also suffered psychological trauma. He became increasingly violent and unstable, eventually murdering his wife and spending the rest of his life in an asylum for the criminally insane. Ford's Theater, the site of Lincoln's murder, was purchased by the federal government and converted into office space and a warehouse. In 1893, the interior collapsed, killing 22 government clerks. The building stood largely abandoned for decades before being restored and reopened as a working theater and museum in the 1960s. The Peterson House across the street where Lincoln died is now a museum preserving the rooms where the president spent his final hours. The gun that killed Abraham Lincoln, Booth's Derringer pistol, is displayed at Ford's Theater Museum. The blood-stained pillow that cradled Lincoln's head as he died is at the Grand Army of the Republic Museum. Pieces of Lincoln's skull bone, removed during his autopsy, remain preserved at the National Museum of Health and Medicine. These grim relics serve as physical connections to one of American history's darkest nights, but perhaps the most haunting artifacts are Lincoln's own words and premonitions about his death. Several people reported that Lincoln had discussed dreams about his assassination in the days before his death. Ward Hill Layman, Lincoln's former law partner and bodyguard, recorded one such dream in which Lincoln walked through the White House and found a corpse lying in state. When Lincoln asked who had died, someone replied, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." Lincoln reportedly said he slept no more that night. On the day of his assassination, Lincoln told his bodyguard, William Crook, "I believe there are men who want to take my life, and I have no doubt they will do it." When Crook suggested canceling the theater trip, Lincoln replied, "I promised my wife, and she has her heart set on it." As Crook prepared to leave for the evening, Lincoln said goodbye. Crook later recalled that Lincoln always said, "Good night, Crook," but on this night he said, "Goodbye, Crook." That small change in wording haunted Crook for the rest of his life. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln remains one of the most studied events in American history, yet mysteries and debates continue. Every few years, new evidence emerges, or old evidence is re-examined, keeping alive questions that may never be fully answered. The location of Booth's missing diary pages, the true extent of the conspiracy, the possible involvement of government officials or Confederate leaders, all these topics continue to fascinate historians and amateur researchers alike. What we do know with certainty is that on April 14, 1865, a talented actor consumed by hatred and ideology committed an act that changed American history forever. John Wilkes Booth thought he would be remembered as a hero who struck down a tyrant. Instead, he became synonymous with betrayal and cowardice, his name forever linked with one of history's great crimes. Abraham Lincoln, who had guided the nation through its darkest crisis and worked to heal its divisions, died at a moment when his wisdom and compassion were needed most. If you found this deep dive into Lincoln's assassination revealing, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more historical content that goes beyond the textbook version. Hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Were you surprised by any of these details? What questions do you still have about that fateful night? Let us know, and we'll continue exploring the hidden corners of history together.